This parsha is Chait, Sarah, and it is the portion that opens up dealing with Sarah and her years that she lived. And I would like to present some pretty interesting information about Sarah and her death that this year, as we go through the portion, would like to be able to highlight this wonderful, beautiful woman. Every Jewish home at Shabbos, we bless our daughters to be like the great matriarchs of faith, Rebecca, Leah, and Sarah. And so this is mentioned over and over, that you hope that your daughter can be as beautiful and holy and righteous as Sarah. And we're going to bring down some pretty interesting ideas from Peshat level all the way down to the Sod level, what this really means. In the first verse of chapter 23, it starts off by saying, Sarah's lifetime, the span of Sarah's life was 127 years. Or as in the Chumash, it probably will say 120 years and 7 years. And the years of the life of Sarah, that's Genesis 23:1. It says, Sarah died in Kiryat Arba, which is Hebron, in the land of Canaan. Abraham came to mourn for Sarah to bewail her. Abraham rose from before his dead and spoke with the children of Heth, saying, I'm a resident and a sojourner among you. Give me a burial possession site among you, so that I might bury my dead from before me. This is, I don't know, I feel the emotion when I read this, an incredible story of a couple that had been together all these years, had struggled with not being able to bear a child, and the desperation of Sarah to go before Hashem, or for Abraham to go before Hashem and beg, like, what's the deal? I don't have an heir, and I'm coming up to 100 years old, no child. His wife's womb was completely, not there. She could not bear a child, and it was pretty obvious. You didn't have to have a great physician to figure that one out. It was obvious she couldn't bear children. And so unless God gave her this child, it wasn't going to happen. And then you have the incident with Ishmael being born, and the tensions in the home, the difficulties that came up from that situation. You also had Abraham having to send Ishmael and his Hagar away, and this sort of difficult times that they endured. And when we read this text, that Sarah's lifetime and the life of Sarah was 100 years and 20 years and 7 years, the portion starts off by saying, Sarah lived. Sarah lived. I would like to title this lecture, Sarah Lived, Making Your Life Count. Making Your Life Count. There are a lot of people who will spend their latter years of their life angry, discontent, upset at what has happened in the past. It's very easy to look back and go, why did this happen? Why did that happen? How did this come up and take place in our life and almost destroy us? And why would God allow these things to happen? And you spend the latter days of your life lamenting and complaining how horrible your life was, and never ever actually enjoy the last years of your life. This is my own little philosophy or ideology, is if you go to a nursing home where elderly people are there, when you get there, you can find some pretty bitter elderly people. Now, they might have good reasons to be that way, but they for sure are not enjoying the last days of their lives. Really, it would be bad to be stuffed off somewhere in a nursing home with no family members to care for you. But what I'm talking about is a person not treasuring the years of service of God. I hear a lot of people saying that when I retire, I would like to travel, the 7 seas. I'd like to go all over the world. I'd like to go to Spain. I'd like to do this, that. But the last years of your life can be the most valuable because you have now gained the status of an elder. and you can begin to share with other people the valuable things that you have learned from your difficult times. Sarah is one of these things. Let's first look at the Peshat basic meaning of this idea that it talks about the years of her life. Rashi says that when it says, and the life of Sarah, speaking of this, Sarah was the only matriarch in which they listed how many years they lived. Rashi says the years of the life of Sarah, they were all equal for goodness, meaning that all of the years were good years. Didn't mean it didn't have struggle. This doesn't mean there wasn't difficulties. They were all good years. And we're going to examine what does that mean to have good years or good days. And it says, in the life of Sarah was 100 years and 20 years and 7. The reason that the word years was written after every digit is to tell you that every digit is to be expounded upon individually. When she was 100 years old, it says that she was like a 20-year-old regarding sin, because she was not liable to punishment. So too, when she was 100 years old, she was without sin. And when she was 20, she was like a 7-year-old when it comes to regarding her beauty. That's on the surface meaning. Let's look at the remez, which is the hinted meaning behind the text. Ba'al Haturim says the word and was in the Gematria is 37, which represents their primary years, those which follows Isaac's birth. She was 90 when he was born, and a total number of years was 127. So that would be a little bit more meaning behind it. And we're going to get there. I want to build all these levels of understanding from the sages of blessed memory. Let's look at the Dirash interpretive meaning. It says, the years of which Sarah really lived were only the last 27 years of her life. Here's a little bit deeper meaning. Now we can all look back. My wife and I were doing this today. We're talking about how blessed our lives have been, how beautiful it is in the community that we're in. But when we look back over our life, it's like, what disasters we went through and weathered. And it would be so easy to have allowed those disasters to form us into completely different people than who we are today. It would not be pretty. And it all had the potential. Those disasters in our life had the potential of making us bitter, caustic, abusive people. Probably would not ever have been successful at marriage if we would have not, at some level, sort of acquiesced to the situation and decided to weather through the storm. But going back, I'm thinking, wow, I would hate to see my worst enemy go through the things that I've gone through. But we realize there's a purpose behind it. It says in Or Hayayim, the life of Sarah, the Torah alludes to almost 100 years that Sarah suffered either with anguish of childlessness or animosity which developed between Ishmael and her son and the son she bore at the age of 90. The years which Sarah really lived, therefore, were only the last 27 years of her life, which she was able to enjoy Isaac's development and undisturbed tranquility. The years of Sarah also alludes to the fact that she was completed, the years of a life allotted to her, but that the immediate cause of her death was the information that was brought to her by a servant about Isaac being sacrificed. It says, according to Midrashic sources, that a servant ran when he knew that one of the servants that were with Abraham, and when he knew he went up on the hill to sacrifice Isaac, he ran and told Sarah. And hearing the news that her husband was in the process of sacrificing her child, she fell dead of shock and horror and heart attack. I couldn't imagine not being able to bear a child. I have a daughter that's had a very difficult time bearing children, and I couldn't imagine the shock and the horror that would be on my daughter's heart and mind. She found out that her husband had now taken their 27-year-old child, or 30-year-old child, and took him up on a mountain to sacrifice him. That brings chills up my spine. This was a very special woman. The Rebbe says The Zohar teaches that Sarah represents the body, while Abraham represents the neshama. Even after death, the soul still remains related to the body. Thus, Abraham, the soul, came to eulogize Sarah, the body, and it says that he wept for her. Chassidut emphasizes the body as a total serve to God, since the ultimate purpose of creation is to sanctify the physical world. The body has a distinct advantage over the soul, of course, in that it means that by which God's will is enacted, meaning that without a body, the soul can't achieve anything. Of course, without a soul, the body can't do anything either. It needs both. And so Abraham needed his wife Sarah. Just like our husbands, as husbands today, we need our wives. You guys are valuable tools and indispensable when it comes to our spiritual development. And I've said this many, many times, that you wives can make or break your husbands. You can destroy your husbands, or you can make him a great tzaddik. And you have a hard, long road to do that either way. It can be a very difficult thing. So it says, therefore God told Abraham, the soul, whatever Sarah the body tells you, do and listen to her voice. That's in chapter 21, verse 12, indicating an inherent superiority of the body over the soul. Although the soul is much more refined than the body, at the time of Mashiach, the imminent coming, we are promised that the body's superiority will be revealed, such as that the soul will be animated by the body. It'll be an amazing time during the time of Mashiach, that our body and soul, there will not be the disparaging difference between the world of physicality and spirituality. Finally, we will have melded together to the point that we'll be elevated at the highest level. Now let's look at the sod level, the deepest level, which we consider sort of the esoteric, mystical level of this text. And it says, and Sarah's life. Of all the women in the world, why is Sarah the only one whose death is mentioned in the Torah? Rabbi Hiya answered, this is not so, for it is written, and Rachel died, and she was buried in the way to Ephrat. And it says, and Miriam died there, and Deborah, Rebekah's nurse, died, Genesis 35:8, and the daughter of Shaua, Yehuda's wife, died, Genesis 38:12. It says, Rabbi Yossi answered, but it is not written of them as it is written of Sarah, of whom it is said, and Sarah's life was 127 years old. These were the years of Sarah's life. No other woman's days and years are specified as they were for Sarah. Furthermore, none of them has a portion of Scripture devoted to them. What was so special about Sarah? Let's go look and see. Eve came into the world, and her experience was that she was poisoned by the snake. Now, you understand the mystical. She was poisoned by the snake. She became impure by what the snake had done and what she did as well. She brought death into the world and to her own husband. Sarah came, and it says, went down, and she rose again without anything clinging to her, as it is written. And Abraham went up to Egypt, and he and his wife and all that he had, Genesis 13:1. So when she went into Egypt, she didn't come out tainted by Egypt. She would still maintain her purity. You remember, the Egyptian couldn't pollute her. He didn't do anything sexually to her. He couldn't have. Now, we look at this contrasting Noah. It says, Noah came to the world, as is written, when he got here, he drank wine and was naked in his tent and exposed himself uncovered in his tent, causing a curse to fall upon one of his sons. Because Abraham and Sarah did not cling to it, Sarah earned supernatural life for herself, her husband and her son after her. This is the meaning of the verse when it says, look at the rock from where you were hewn, and to the hole of the pit from where you were dug out. Isaiah 51:1. Therefore it is written, and Sarah's life was, for she merited all. It is not so for the rest of the women. And Eve's life was, and so on. Sarah clung to life, therefore her life was her own. We're getting somewhere. We're starting to understand what made Sarah's life so beautiful. What made her stand out compared to the rest of the women of the Torah? Psalm 23 says this, "Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me for all of the days of my life, and I shall dwell in the house of the Lord forever." A key point here. How will the presence of Hashem dwell with you for your whole life? It's to dwell in the presence of Hashem. Notwithstanding the difficulties in the Midrashim between the different levels and some of the things that have not been able to sort of be fully answered about the text, the interpolations offered to fill the gap at the end of the story here, this episode, and the recitation of the years and not her death. We are sure that her life was full and long days, full of prosperity and goodness. But what made the last years of her life so incredibly special? Let's look at a patriarch. You remember when Joseph's father was about to die, and it said that these were sort of, the text in the Midrashic literature says that these were the best years of his life. Why? Because he was reunited with his son. He had all of his children with him, and now all of his great-grandchildren and great-great-grandchildren were with him. And they were doing well, prospering very well in Egypt. It seems that Sarah finally hit a place in her life where she was completely committed 100% to service of Hashem. Service to Hashem was loving her husband, taking care of her husband, guiding her husband, and helping to raise a young boy that was going to be one day a great patriarch of faith. Her last 27 years were 27 years filled with the service of God and right sort of in the zone. And I guess the question that I'd have to ask us all, to include myself, is what am I going to do with the rest of my life? Do I look around and complain and become concerned as to why my life isn't the way I think it should be? Or should I look around somewhat like Sarah and say, this is my life. This is my life. And until God intervenes in some supernatural way, this is my life. We don't hear of Sarah complaining of not having a child. We hear Abraham going to God. It doesn't mean that Sarah didn't complain to her husband. I'm sure she was quite concerned. But you just don't hear it. It seemed that this sort of steady rock of Gibraltar was waiting on the day that the angel would come. And then when she heard the news, it was still funny. All right? She denied it, of course. And it's not unusual to deny something when you're concerned that you're going to offend your guest. But the point was is she waited patiently. And then when that time came, blessing began to flow. In last class, we talked about building vessels for abundance. And we were discussing this in the beginning of the class, that you can expect good things to happen in your life when you're devoted to the service of the King, period. Whatever that may be, it may not be teaching, it may not be being able to go off and do great acts of kindness, but it means that you are doing what you are supposed to be doing in the service of Hashem. You see, Sarah knew what her job was. And though I'm sure she would have loved to have been the mother of 24 children, she couldn't be. She had to only be the mother of one child. That was her job. Unlike the other generations of Jewish mothers who had many, many children, who could enjoy the great inheritance, she did not have that opportunity. But she pleased God and she did what was her purpose in life. Aurelio said this morning or this evening as we were chatting, he was mentioning to someone who was talking about, where they're going to go from now. Their life had basically just turned into a mess, and finally things are starting to get sorted out, and this person was asking, what should my next move be? And he says, your next move should be focused on one thing. What is your purpose? What are you supposed to be doing in life? There are a lot of people that are doing things in their life that they thought was supposed to be their purpose, and they only found out once they got in it, it was only driven by material things. It was only driven by their lust for power or whatever authority. They get into that position and they realize that, yes, they're making a lot of money, they're doing well, but they're not fulfilling their purpose. When we look at Sarah's life and we realize the value of her days, it says that her days were long. What does that mean, your days were long? Doesn't literally mean they were on, when's the longest days? The summertime? Is that when the days are the longest? Doesn't mean she dwelled in the summertime all the time. It's not talking about hours. It means that she made use of every hour of her day. You would think, well, what could she have possibly been doing? The same thing that you do every day, except the fact she knew and realized, she internalized her purpose in the world. And that was to be a light to her community, be a light to people around her. And even though she was going about her day, not as some great Rebbitzin, some great rabbi's wife, she was going around being Abraham's wife. She was going around being the mother of Isaac. She was doing the very best at that job. And those last 27 years of service to Hashem were the most prosperous, most productive years of her life. As we approach older age, right? I hate to get into that. What are we going to do with our life? Could it be said of each one of us when we are passed away and we die that this individual lived their life to the fullest? Doesn't mean every year since you were born that you lived it well, but I'm talking about in the last years of your life, you're going to say, this person was very satisfied with what they were doing and very at peace with what they were doing. I hope that that can be said with all of us. It says that it's kind of sad that you look at a tombstone and it has the year you're born, the year that you die, and that dash, and your whole life is summed up in a dash. Just a simple dash. And there's nothing like being able to say, you know what, doggone it, I'm now at the place in my life that I can do the service of Hashem. And many of you are already doing the service of Hashem. You support Torah. You learn Torah. You conduct yourself with the highest level of modesty and goodness toward people around you. Very, very important attributes. And you are serving Hashem. Don't think you should be doing something else. Do what you are supposed to do. Don't do what somebody else is supposed to do. Do what you're supposed to do. And if yours is to only have one productive fruit in your life, then you make sure you take care of that one productive fruit. And if it is God willing, blesses you with much more abundance, then do that. But make sure that all those things are committed to the service of Hashem. Now I would like to close with this last part. It says that Abraham came. So it says Sarah's lifetime, or Sarah's life. And then it says, I'm a resident and a sojourner among you, verse 4. Give me a burial possession site among you, so that I will bury my dead before me. The children of Heth replied to Abraham, saying, Accept from us, our master, you are a great one before the Lord among us. Bury your dead in the best of our burial sites, and no one will basically charge you for this. You can do it free. Why? Because Abraham was God's representative to the world, and very clearly was revered. But that doesn't work, does it? Something that is as valuable as Sarah was, he knew that he had to place an investment in the property that God had given him. He bought it. It says that he bought that, and if you work out the numerical value of it, that he bought it for 600,000 souls. So for every Jewish soul that lived and were to live in the land, he bought that land for them as well. In verse 4, he says, Onkelos writes this, influenced by the post-biblical definition of the word ger or proselyte, a ger or proselyte, Onkelos translates it as such. However, it is all reasonable to do so, since Abraham is certainly not saying that he is a proselyte with the children of Heth, and the Targumist retains the words original meaning here says, give me. Abraham needed to secure permission from the entire city to build the grave for his wife because the burial site affects the entire surroundings, according to Rashbam. The burial possession site. That term says the usual phrase burial possession site is understood as if it read give me a burial site as a possession. Chazuni explains, if I buried my dead in the field owned by someone else, on the day the owner would plow the field or upend the grave and disperse the bones. But if I possessed the field, I would never have that concern. So the idea is Abraham is buried. He wants this land. Why did he want to buy this specific plot of land? Who is buried in Abraham's grave? Sounds like a joke. Like who's buried in Washington's tomb? Adam and Eve. So he's going to buy the plot that Adam and Eve are in, and that all the patriarchs would soon be buried in, or most all of them. With that in closing, as husbands, we have a huge responsibility to our family and to our wife. Abraham, it says, went and mourned. He buried his wife, and then he remarried. But the person he remarried was Hagar. They had another 7 or 8 children together, I believe, and continued on with life. Abraham had an obligation to make sure that his wife, who was a beautiful woman, was a righteous woman, was revered and honored. And as men, we have a responsibility to our wives. If we're going to make our life count, then we make our life count by revering our wives and putting them in the place of honor and respect that they need and they deserve. Why? Because in many aspects, our wife is our body. And we are the soul of that relationship and family. And when we nurture that relationship, we can truly make our life count to its fullest. That concludes this lecture.